he says, the caravan's leaving. Are you coming or are you staying? And he said, there you are in your comfortable prison. Are you leaving? Or are you coming or are you staying?
That leads me then into the obvious question, your reversion to Islam. Speak to us about that period.
Well, I was brought up as a Christian. I was at boarding school in Zimbabwe until UDI, and then my parents decided to move me to England because they feared there might be a Mau situation developing there. And so suddenly I went to English public school, and it was a very rude shock for me. I hated going to England, and especially the cold weather, and sometimes the people there seemed very insular and seemed to have much narrower horizons than the people I was used to keeping company with in Africa. So it was a difficult time. How did I come to Islam? Right, exactly. So while I was at school, and while church was compulsory, I went along with it. I sang in the choir. I enjoyed the songs, the tunes more than anything. The words didn't always make sense. And I found that I had questions that the priests couldn't answer. So, for example, I'd say, well, if Jesus was God, then who looked after the universe while he was dead for 3 days? And they couldn't answer that. And I said, if he was God, then who is he praying to? Because he wouldn't pray to himself, would he? So there were these obvious kind of contradictions within the teachings of Christianity that really quite early on I was saying, well, I believe in Jesus as a historical figure, and I believe in God as the creator of the universe, but I'm not quite sure about the church and what it's teaching. And I had questions. I had really intimations that things were not quite right, but I couldn't put it into words. I couldn't articulate what it was, and I couldn't see what was wrong, if you like, what the discrepancies were, beyond a kind of very obvious assessment. But certainly once I left school and it was no longer obligatory, then I found that it was not spiritually nourishing. And I then really read very widely. I looked for knowledge wherever I could find it, and in a way this was the confirmation of the hadith of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he said, knowledge is the lost property of the mu'min, so you can pick it up wherever you find it. And that's what I was busy doing. And in some funny way, I didn't come to Islam until last of all. And more refreshingly, the way I came to Islam was through meeting my Sheikh Abdul Qadir. And what happened was that my sister, in fact, had accepted Islam about 2 years previously. And it really hadn't made much of an impact on my own life. It was very much the kind of hippie era and doing your own thing, and whatever turns you on, that's fine, go ahead and do it. So I said, well, if it's good for you, then I wish you all the best. But I wasn't really interested in finding out what it was or why or anything like that. But she kept on saying, when I came to live in London, there's this really interesting person, and the people around him very interesting, you should meet them. And I said, well, yeah, maybe one day, but I had friends and I was busy, and then one day she said, I've arranged for you to have lunch with he wasn't a sheikh then, he was a muqaddim, but with Abdul Qadir, she said. And so we met for lunch, and he hardly spoke about it at all, in fact, but he talked about the wider society and the times we lived in with great perception. And also he had very interesting questions, so for example he said, what do you want? Which is the $99 million question in life, really, isn't it? And at the time I was very interested in flamenco guitar, so I said I'd like to be a really good flamenco guitarist. And he said, no, what do you really want? So he went straight through that. And I said, I'd like to know what's behind everything. And he said, oh, that's much more interesting. And so I was aware that he had this kind of vibrance, if you like, and this awareness of what is beneath the surface of things. And then also when we parted, he said, Salam alaikum, and I said, I like the way you put your hand over your heart. And he said, oh, well, that's where everything happens. And at that point I was very much aware that I was very much living in my head, and I didn't really have access to my heart. And he invited me to a gathering of dhikr at his zawiyah, which I accepted. And I went to that, and it was, it had a very deep impact on me, on my being, because suddenly I was in a group of people who got on with each other, who were living together as a community. The dhikr was very powerful. in fact, they began with Maghrib prayer, and they said, do you want to join us? And I said, well, yeah, why not? So they said, well, you'll have to wash. I said, okay. So someone taught me how to do wudu, and I stood in the prayer line, and I just followed the movement. So that was really the first time that I consciously went into sajda. So all of these were having new experiences, and the dhikr was beautiful. It was singing from the diwan of Sheikh Muhammad ibn Habib, who is the first teacher of Sheikh Abdul Qadir. He's buried in Morocco, in Meknes. And then after the dhikr, the Sheikh gave a talk, and he talked about all the things in a way that I'd been doing, because I during the dhikr I'd been sort of very inquisitive and looking around and a bit fidgety, and then he talked about the nafs in his talk, and about how it often is its own worst enemy, and how it in the name of finding out, it stops itself from finding out, all these things. And I thought, how does he know all this? Because he didn't look at me at all. I mean, all throughout the dhikr, his eyes were down, and he never lifted his eyes once, and yet he seems to know everything I was up to.
What you're up to. Okay.
And then he ended with this wonderful kind of metaphor, and I've never forgotten it. And he said, it's as if you're in a small town on the edge of the desert, and you're in a hotel, and it's a comfortable room, it's all the amenities. And it's just as you're realizing that, you suddenly hear this commotion outside the window, and you look out, and you see this caravan leaving town, heading towards the desert. And it's, all the children running around along the side of the camels, and the dogs barking, and the camel drivers making sure their loads are on tight, and everyone's wishing them well and waving goodbye. And he said, just at that moment, the leader of the caravan looks up, and he says, the caravan's leaving. Are you coming or are you staying? And he said, there you are in your comfortable prison. Are you leaving? Or are you coming or are you staying? And he sort of ended the talk with those words. Then we had a meal together. But those words came back to me, and I realized it was almost like an invitation to myself, saying, what we have here is a caravan that's setting out in search of knowledge.